So we now have arrived at the third and final lecture of this series, On's Dream of Peace. And our objective in this lecture is to understand and critically discuss what On's vision of Korean independence and peace in the East and the world were, and how he thought they could be achieved. So what did On hope to accomplish by shooting Ito Hirobumi? And he was asked this on multiple occasions, and sometimes he gave long answers. At one point, he gave a list of 15 reasons, for example, why he killed Ito Hirobumi. But he would often summarize them as he did it for Korean independence and peace in the East. Now, in terms of what did he mean by this? Well, in terms of background information, one thing we need to understand is how the supporters of Japanese colonization of Korea justified that colonization. And the argument went basically that Korea was weak because it was uncivilized, right? Korea needed to become modern. It needed to become powerful, because if it wasn't a powerful independent country, other countries could expand into Korea and threaten Japan. So for example, if Russia had been able to expand its influence into Korea, it could have used Korean ports to to act as a base for the Russian Navy and Army that could have posed a direct and serious threat to Japan's own security. So in the face of this threat, Japan had to expand its power into Korea and take away Korean sovereignty at times in order to reform it. And of course, when this eventually, when this did fail, when these reforms failed, this would then argument would justify annexation. Now, On challenged this because while he accepted that Korea needed to become a stronger country through reform, through modernization, he argued that Japan should help Korea become strong while respecting its independence, and we'll go more into those details later. So for On, though, what's key is he had these twin goals, this idea that we need Korean independence and peace in the East, but these were connected because he believed very firmly that Korean independence would lead to peace in the East, and that Ito Hirobumi's policies of seeking to expand Japanese power in Korea was actually what was damaging peace in the East. Now, it helps us if we kind of define our terms, and especially we want to understand what On meant when he referred to these terms. And sometimes, unfortunately, he wasn't able to really develop his meaning of these things as much as it would help for us to understand his ideas, but we can kind of talk a little bit about them and hopefully understand more of what he meant by them. But by independence, On meant that Korea should be an independent nation state that would govern itself, right? That would not have to have other countries telling it what to do, and that as a nation state, its sovereignty was sacrosanct. That you couldn't just come in and again tell Koreans what to do; it had to be respected. And in particular, he believed in international law, that all nation states should have equal rights in international law. So that they have to kind of respect each other. Now, he also understood that people would violate international law, but it was his hope that people would follow through and respect international law as they should. But he was not naive. He realized that law doesn't work unless there's force behind it. Now, An Chung-gun also was very much concerned with peace. Right, one of his prison writings was called "In Peace in the East," and unfortunately, because he wasn't able to finish this writing, it's not always clear what he meant by peace. Right, peace is a very complex term. It can mean simply the absence of war. And An Chung-gun certainly understood peace as the absence of war. He did not like war. He thought it was very destructive to humanity and property, right? He saw war as something that killed a lot of people and destroyed the work of those people. And we can gain a greater understanding of his idea of peace if we also consider his critique of war as harming the development of civilization, right? What we can term modernization. An saw war as something that kind of perverted civilization, that treated modernity in a bad way. And it's kind of interesting because this is something people often talk about, how An Chung-gun, was kind of prophetic in some ways, that he saw some things early. Remember, this is happening before World War I, right? We talk a lot about how after World War I, many people, especially in Western Europe, came to question the values of science and technology after they used it to kill large numbers of people. An Chung-gun was already doing that in 1909, right? Talking about this kind of problem, how war perverts and hurts the fruits of modernity. And we can get a sense of An's concern here and what he meant by peace if we look at the introduction of his treatise on peace in the East, where he discusses his ideas about peace in Asia. And unfortunately, he was never able to finish this, what was probably going to be a fairly long work, but he finished enough that we can get some idea of what he was talking about. And in the introduction, he says, "It is an ancient and unchanging principle that union brings success and division brings failure. But today the world is divided into East and West as different races struggle against each other." Right? So and this is important because he will accept some Asianist ideas. He's not a racist. Right? He's going to say some critical things about Western countries and about the imperialism being practiced by these countries that were predominantly white. But he wasn't a racist. Right? He sees a problem in this division of the human race between East and West. Right? He sees this as causing difficulties. Because of this division, different people struggle against each other. So he accepts some of the social Darwinist ideas that there is racial struggle. It's just he doesn't see that as correct and right. Right? He sees social Darwinism as describing the world in which he lived, but he didn't see it as the way things should be. And you can see it here where he talks about, because of this conflict, instead of studying agriculture and commerce, people develop new inventions like machine guns, airplanes, and submarines that all have as their purpose the destruction of life and property. And Ahn discussed very vividly in this same introduction what this perversion by war of civilization modernity did. Right? He wrote, "Young people are trained and sent off to war. Their precious lives are sacrificed, their blood flows like rivers, and their bodies pile up in mountains of corpses. Not a day passes that this does not occur. Since it is a fundamental principle that all people wish to live and not to die, how is it that this occurs openly and for all the world to see? My heart turns cold at the very thought of it." So Ahn is deeply disturbed, right, about how this kind of, again, this perversion of civilization and modernity leads to the death of so many people, the destruction of so much property, which he describes here so vividly. Now, what did Ahn mean by civilization? And again, unfortunately, he doesn't really go into a huge amount of detail in his writings. And I think he would have if he would have had the time, but unfortunately his execution prevented him from doing so. But if we look at his autobiography, we can get some understanding of the political aspects of his understanding of civilization, of modernity. So he's talking about how one of his friends was unjustly arrested and thrown in prison. And this is not by the Japanese government, but this is by the Korean government. And he talks about, "When I passed Independence Gate, reflecting on what had happened, I was torn up inside. My friend was innocent, but had been locked up and might never know freedom again. How could he endure this cold weather in prison?" It was winter when this occurred. "When will this wicked government be cast down and reformed so that the thieving and traitorous officials can be swept away and a civilized and independent country established in which the people will have their rights and freedoms? With such thoughts in mind, I wept bitter tears, making it difficult for me to continue my journey." So again, Ahn's really disturbed with what's happening in Korea. And it's interesting that he talks about this at Independence Gate, right? And it would seem that he has this feeling that even though Korea at this time was an independent country for the most part, it still hasn't been able to develop its civilization like it should, because here you have this Korean government that has put his friend in jail unjustly. And I want to stress, he doesn't want to overthrow the Korean government, even though he says, well, when will this wicked government be cast down? He was very much loyal to the Korean emperor, and he always refers in his autobiography as His Majesty the Emperor of Korea. So he's not anti-imperial. He's upset, though, that you have these corrupt officials who treat people badly. And this is the key thing about his understanding of civilization, right? We should have our rights and freedoms, right? So you can kind of see, and this goes back to this idea of democracy, right? Usually in a democracy, not only do you have the right to vote, to exercise political power, you have other rights like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, these kind of things that go along with democracy, because you can't really practice what is the point of being able to vote if you can't discuss with people about who you should vote for or what this candidate is like and so forth. So even though he believed in the Korean emperor, had this understanding of rights and freedoms that people should have. What exactly those rights and freedoms should be. Clearly from this example, he's understanding rights in terms of being able to escape from illegal punishments and treatment by unjust officials, but it could have meant something like freedom of speech and press and so forth. Now, An also made several last statements before he died, before he was executed. And in one of these statements, we can get some understanding of his understanding of the economic aspects of civilization. Right? He said, I spent 3 years overseas, eating in the wind and sleeping in the dew for the restoration of Korean independence and the preservation of peace in the East. But now I will die in this place, having failed to accomplish these goals. My 20 million brothers and sisters, that was the approximate population of Korea at that time, devote yourself to learning and in developing industry. If you restore freedom and independence, the causes to which I devoted myself, then I can die without any regrets. So, again, you had this idea that civilization and enlightenment will make your country strong. And part of that, right, part of that modernity, remember we talked about those 4 revolutions, one of them was an economic and industrial revolution. And clearly he believed in those things as well. So he had this understanding of building the civilization in which people would have rights, would have their freedoms, but would also have a certain amount of wealth, right? And this was wealth and industry developed to help the country, but also it would seem that would also go to the people as well, so that they could enjoy also a sense of freedom and independence, right? He kind of connected these ideas all together. And like I say, though, I have to stress, a lot of this I'm talking about is probability, because An simply didn't talk about a lot of these things directly. That wasn't so much his main purpose. So we know then that An Chun-gun did not like war, that it was harmful to human beings, it killed human beings, destroyed property, and it created an environment in which the fruits of civilization and in modernity, instead of helping people, hurt people. Now here's the thing, though. Most people will agree, will say, yeah, we don't like war, war is bad. But people still fight wars. And a lot of times when we ask this question, why do people fight wars, we often mean it as kind of a rhetorical question. Why would people, how could people ever do something as silly or stupid as fight a war? And the problem with that is, it doesn't really help us, right, to understand why people fight. And if we don't understand why people fight, we can't really figure out how to establish peace, right? We have to understand the reasons why people fight. And An Chun-gun had lived through 2 very serious wars that shook his country and the whole East Asian region, right? The Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. So in his unfinished essay on peace in the East, he tries to figure out what were the causes of those wars, right? Because if we can diagnose the causes of those wars, we can get peace, right? An Chun-gun was very realistic in this sense, right? He was a practical person. He wanted to know what caused war so we can prevent wars and bring peace in the East. So in his On Peace in the East, An Chun-gun argues that it's the departure from moral principles that cause war, right? He says that human beings should be moral, and because we act immorally, we have war. And so, for example, he talks about the roots of this conflict, and he essentially is meaning just conflicts in East Asia, can be found in the fact that since ancient times, the people of the East devoted themselves to literary pursuits and to defending their own countries. We never invaded Europe or took even an inch of European land. People, animals, and even the very trees and grass know this. But over the last few centuries, European countries have abandoned all morality, used military power to solve any problem they faced, and cultivated contentious hearts completely lacking in moral scruples. And among the European countries, Russia was the worst. Now, I think in that quote from On Peace in the East, An does overdo, in a sense, the Asian commitment to peace to a certain degree. Of course, Asia was not always peaceful, though it is technically true that Chinese, Japanese, and Korean people did not ever take over any European land. That is his basic overall point there is true, though I would argue that the region was a little bit less peaceful and more violent than he kind of says there. And also, he's a little hard on Russia. He doesn't quite understand the situation that Russia was in, that in many ways it was hemmed in by the other imperial powers and was trying to compete and keep up with them. So An is, I think he's a little hard, perhaps a little unfair to Russia, though again, Russia was a country that had been threatening to expand into Korea, so we can also kind of understand why An had such a kind of focus on Russia, though again he kind of overdoes and overplays, I think, Russia's strength and influence. An also kind of missed the importance of revolutions that we had discussed earlier in providing the power that made imperialism possible. It's not simply that Europeans had suddenly become bad, whereas before they were good. They now had the capacity in order to go out and colonize and to form empires. And there were, as we talked about before, there were economic reasons for doing so. It wasn't simply morality. And we can kind of understand these things, though, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. The An Gun lived in this time period. There were limits to his knowledge. He didn't know any, the only two languages he knew were really Korean and classical Chinese. He didn't know any European languages or Western languages, for example, other than a little bit of French. So there were some limits. But all that being said, An did recognize the growth of Western power, right? He did ultimately kind of understand that, and we need to kind of really keep that in mind, that even though An sees Japan as a threat to Korea, while it's under Ito Hirobumi, he sees the bigger threat as the West, right? He sees, and in that he's in a sense correct about in a certain way. He also, what's also very important here, though, is that An Gun connected the growth of empire with a loss of morality, right? And I think this is important to keep in mind. I mean, part of this is that because he was someone who'd been influenced by Confucianism, because he was a Catholic, he was very interested in morality. But if we want to understand his understanding of what the world should be like and why he acted the way we do, we need to understand that he also understood the world, and the reason why people acted is being very closely connected to morality. So An Gun saw war as and conflict in a sense as rising out of this kind of disunity, which is in a sense connected to a departure from morality, right? When we don't recognize that we're all human beings that have particular rights that should be respected, that leads to conflict and war, right? That's a lot of what An Gun seems to be arguing. So that's what he sees as kind of the cause of war. Now, what determines who will win a war? Right, that's also important for us to understand, and for how An Gun sought to build peace. So in looking at the Sino-Japanese War, right, this war between China and Japan, An Gun wrote in his treatise, China is dozens of times larger and richer than Japan. How then could it be defeated so easily? Throughout its history, the Chinese have referred to themselves as the great empire of China and called other people barbarians, showing tremendous arrogance. Moreover, powerful officials and royal relatives seized control of the country and did whatever they pleased. Thus the high and low became enemies, and there was no peace among the people. This is what led to China's humiliating defeat. So for An Gun, right, again, you see this kind of principle that in unity we have this kind of power. Right, and the Chinese were divided. And what divided the Chinese? It was a lack, in a sense, of morality. Right, there was a lack of humility by looking down on other people that prevented them from reforming and taking other people seriously. There was also this kind of immorality, this corruption among people in power that led them to treat the average Chinese people badly, and that caused a division. Right, so the departure from morality leads to conflict and division, which itself leads to weakness. And in his On Peace in the East, An also connected this to Japan, right? He said it was the opposite of Japan. He said, by contrast, while discord and strife have never ceased in Japan since the Meiji Restoration, leading to diplomatic disputes, the opposing factions quickly resolve their differences, make peace, and unite with each other, forming a single patriotic party. That is why Japan won, and he's talking about the war with China, and is in accordance with the saying, a fight between brothers is better than being friendly with strangers. So again, An is kind of, he's switching this idea around in a sense. I mean, it's the same basic idea, he's just applying it differently to say, see, look, Japan was unified. Even though they had conflict, right? Even though they disagreed with each other, they were able to quickly resolve their differences and make peace. And An, in an article he wrote before he killed Ito, he talks about the necessity of union, and he emphasizes on how important it is to be humble, to have union. So in a sense, he's saying, the Japanese are kind of humble enough to be able to work out their disputes and work together, and this helps them to win. The problem, though, from An's perspective, is that Japan only understood Japanese unity, not East Asian unity, right? So in a sense, by fighting China, Japan, while being able to win the war because it was unified as a nation, created bigger problems because it had violated racial unity, right? And this is, An Gun is very much affected by Asianism, and to a certain degree by social Darwinism. And he saw the world as having this kind of racial conflict. And that didn't mean he thought it was right, he thought it was wrong, but he did understand that what he called the yellow race were under threat from the white race, right? And that's important for us to understand his thought. Now, On believed, and I mean he was correct, that Russia had long wanted a warm water port, and he thought that they wanted one in southern Manchuria. And the problem was Japan's war against China had weakened China, and it had showed to the world just how weak China was. And that allowed the expansion of Western imperialism into China, which helped encourage the Boxer Rebellion, for example. Right? So because Japan violated this policy, this principle of racial unity, this weakened China, and it weakened all Asian people, right? Because it allowed Western imperialism to expand more into the region, particularly the British and the French, but especially also with the with the Boxer Rebellion, because the Boxers threatened the Trans-Siberian Railway the Russians were building. This allowed Russia to expand into Manchuria under the pretext of protecting its railroad. But as we discussed earlier, they were expanding their power in Manchuria, and they refused to withdraw their troops that they had put in Manchuria to protect the railroad, even when the Boxers were defeated. And this led to the Russo-Japanese War, which An Chungun would refer to as a reckless war. So just like with China, An had to ask, why is it that Japan, even though it was smaller than Russia, why was it able to win? And An made several arguments here. One is that he argued that Japan acted in accordance with the will of heaven. And what's important for us to keep in mind here is that An took this seriously. This isn't just rhetoric. He was a very, very devout Catholic. So he took this very, very seriously. And in his autobiography, multiple times, he stated that heaven had saved his life, that heaven had given him the opportunity to kill Ito, though that wasn't his autobiography, that was elsewhere. He really believed that heaven acted in the world, though of course being a Catholic he understood that as God, but he's writing for a non-Catholic audience, so he talks about heaven. So he believed very strongly that if you did what was right, God or heaven would help you. And so Japan in part was able to win because it had acted in accordance with the will of heaven. It had acted morally, while Russia did not. What did he mean by this? Well, he argued that it was a fundamental principle of the universe that there is in unity there is strength, and in disunion there is weakness. And he sees this war as being a war where Russia is invading and trying to harm the East. So this yellow Asian race is uniting together to fight for the independence of Korea and for peace in the East, which is threatened by Russia, right? So he tends to connect all these things, right? God has these principles, these moral principles that we should follow because they make us strong and because they're right, and in their rightness they give us strength. And here it was right for Japan to fight for Korean independence, and of course that's connected to peace in the East, because when you have Korean independence is integral to peace in the East. You're not going to have peace if you don't have a independent Korea. And that this was also a war fought to protect yellow people against white imperialism, right? An saw imperialism being something that was being carried out primarily by white people, by the white empires at this time. He doesn't see this as an intrinsic feature of whiteness. He doesn't see this conflict as being driven by anything intrinsic to being white. If white people would just go back to being moral, we wouldn't have this problem anymore. And also what's key, though, is because the war was being fought for these good principles, the Chinese and Koreans supported the Japanese, right? And An argues that their support was integral to Japan's victory. So Koreans and Chinese, believing that Japan was fighting not only in its own interest, but the interest of the whole race, followed through with this principle of racial unity, and they would then help Japan gain this victory. Now, one thing I just want to note as an aside, one conflict, one kind of problem that An Chungun dealt with in his own thinking, I think inadequately, was he had a problem accounting for material causes. So, for example, one of the key reasons why Russia was defeated by Japan had to do with logistics. Russia had not completed the Trans-Siberian Railway by this time, so it was having to bring lots of supplies and lots of troops from European Russia, and because the railroad was not complete, this took longer. And Japan, in contrast, was right there, was very close to Manchuria, was able to establish bases in Korea, in fact. And so this is one reason why Japan was able to win the war, were these material causes, just the fact of logistics, that it was easier for Japan to field and supply armies and send reinforcements than it was for Russia. And this is something that I think if he had more time, he would have dealt more with these issues. But in his thinking, as it's left to us, he didn't deal with them adequately, I think. What's key for On, though, is it wasn't just what Koreans and Chinese did, but what they could have done, right? An Chun-gun argues, hey, if we had, instead of helping Japan win this war against Russia, we could have launched revenge attacks against Japan for killing our empress. And the Russians could have taken advantage of those revenge attacks to launch counterattacks against Japan. And then the Chinese would have said, well, let's get on this too, and let's get revenge against the Japanese for what they've done to us. And then the Japanese army would have been divided and would not have been able to win its victories. Right, so An Chun-gun doesn't just talk about Chinese and Korean support, what he sees as Chinese and Korean support for Japan's war against Russia. He also says, this is what the Chinese and the Koreans could have done had they not followed this principle of racial solidarity. But they didn't do, and this would have really harmed Japan. This would have caused a lot of problems. And if Japan was not able to defeat the Russians, right, if this would have then become a stalemate, Britain and France would have expanded their power in China. And then on rights and on peace in the East, the United States, Germany, Belgium, Austria, Portugal, and Greece, and other nations would have gathered their eastern fleets together in the Bohai Sea, and you can see it there around China, planning to make agreements to divide up East Asia among them according to their own interests. This would have caused great destruction. But what prevented all this happening was because Chinese and Koreans, instead of just thinking of, hey, let's get revenge against Japan, they said, nope, our Asia and the yellow race are under threat from this invader. We need to work together in the name of racial solidarity to protect ourselves. And so they prevented, by helping to support Japan to a certain degree, and also by not taking revenge on Japan, they helped to prevent this great destruction of East Asia and this great Western imperial expansion that could have happened. Now the problem, though, is, from An's perspective, he says, we Chinese and Koreans, we acted properly, but the Japanese didn't. Right? From An's perspective, Japan was just about ready to win this war, but instead of making one last push to victory, they sought a peace treaty. Right? They asked for peace talks. Now, this again is, Japan was not that close to victory. In fact, they were very much exhausted by this war with Russia, even though they had won basically all the major battles. They were running out of resources, whereas Russia still had some. And so Japan entered into this request for negotiated peace. But An Chun-gun didn't know that. Japanese people didn't know that either, because Japan had not, the government had not let on that things were as bad as they were in terms of supplies and reinforcements and so forth. So An Chun-gun saw this as just crazy, because he didn't know the background, what was actually going on. He just said, Japan, what are they thinking? They could have won this war and absolutely destroyed the Russians and that threat forever, but instead they sought this peace treaty. Moreover, they accepted that there should be talks in the United States, right? We talked about earlier, Portsmouth is in the U.S. And An Chun-gun's like, well, why is this going on? Shouldn't this happen in Japan? Because they're winning the war. It should happen in Japan, not in the U.S. But again, An Chun-gun didn't quite understand the international situation at the time. In addition, An Chun-gun was frustrated because he argued that the American president favored Russia, and because of that, Japan got actually very little from the peace treaty. For example, they didn't get an indemnity. Russia didn't have to pay Japan any money. And again, this is where An Chun-gun had some misunderstandings about the situation. If anything, the American president favored Japan, not Russia. Theodore Roosevelt kind of took their side more often than not during these peace negotiations. But An Chun-gun didn't know that. And while An was kind of mistaken on these points, he did recognize that there was a problem in that Japan, in this treaty, was recognized as having a paramount position in Korea. And An is kind of like, well, wait a second here. This war was being fought, as stated in the declaration of war from Japan, that was being fought for Korean independence. And Japan has been saying for years through all these different treaties with us that they are fighting for independence. So why is it that not only have they said, put in a treaty that they have a paramount position, violating our independence, why is it that they did this in this treaty with these white empires that are threatening Asia, right? So An Chungun sees this as a kind of betrayal of racial solidarity, right? And of the Japanese or of the Chinese and Korean people who had supported Japan. And An sees this as going to be something that's going to cause a lot of problems in the future, right? He already said, if we Chinese and Koreans had not supported Japan during this war, and if we would have betrayed them, think of all the problems that would have happened. Now look, Japan's betraying us, so something is going to happen terrible in Asia now because of this. Now we face a problem here because after An Chungun talks about this, the Russo-Japanese War, and how Japan has kind of betrayed racial solidarity and the Korean and Chinese people, and that this is going to cause a lot of problems, he just kind of ends there, right? That's the chapter he was able to finish, but he didn't have enough time to continue, right? So this is an unfinished work. It just kind of stops there. So even though he talked generally what would happen if these issues were not dealt with, he doesn't talk about them specifically, right? He doesn't go into much detail specifically. In addition, he doesn't explain how they should be dealt with, right? He doesn't say this is what needs to be done, and he doesn't say what we need to do to build a lasting peace. How do we finally resolve this, right? He talks about these things in general. He doesn't talk about them specifically. He had a table of contents which indicates that he was going to talk about these things specifically, but he's not able to do that because he's killed. He's executed. Moreover, doesn't really explain how Ito Hirobumi fits into all of this, right? The last bit, I haven't mentioned Ito Hirobumi at all, so how do we connect why An Chungun killed Ito Hirobumi to this whole desire for peace in the East, right? Now, fortunately, we do have a primary source that helps us answer these questions. After An Chungun was found guilty and sentenced to be executed, he had, according to Japanese law, a right to an appeal, right? He could have appealed his case. And he wasn't interested in appealing his case, but he was ready to die. But he did want time to finish this essay. So he went for a post-trial interview, a kind of hearing with a judge, and someone took notes on this, and he explained, I'm willing to give up my appeal, but I would like a stay of execution. I'd like my execution be delayed so I can finish my work. And the judge was curious and asked him about what it was, about his ideas on the peace in the East, and those ideas were written down, and that primary source is extant. So we're able to kind of get to some idea of how he would deal with these issues I just mentioned through this report. So in this question of where Ito fits in, we can gain some kind of understanding of why An targeted him and saw him as being so dangerous. An in this record says, as I've said many times in his declaration of war at the beginning of the conflict between Russia and Japan, the Japanese emperor maintained that Korea's independence would be strengthened. Nevertheless, Prince Ito placed all military and judicial power in the hands of Japan, and even intended to take control of the Korean administration. How could doing these things be called protecting Korean independence? So An Chungun saw Ito as having tricked the emperor of Japan, right? The emperor had made it clear what Japan was supposed to be doing, what it was trying to do. It was trying to fight for Korean independence and for peace in the East, which of course An is understood as being directly related to each other. And Ito had tricked the Japanese emperor into thinking that he was following these policies when in fact he was violating the rightful wishes of the Japanese emperor. And therefore removing him would allow Japan to reform its policy. So you have people like Ito in Japan who are following these policies of encouraging racial division, and An Chungun has gotten rid of Ito, the kind of leader of this group of people, and that will give Japan this chance to change its policy. Now we are fortunate again that we have this record because it helps us to see what An wanted to do, right? What he thought could be done. And what's also key about this is it shows that An was not anti-Japanese, right? He was anti-Ito, but he was not anti-Japanese. And he in fact argued that Japan should change its policy, as he outlined there, but it should act as a responsible leader of East Asia. In fact, he refers to it as the head of East Asia because it had successfully modernized. So An did not think that Japan and Korea should just have a completely separate relationship. He was not anti-Japanese. He wanted Japanese people to help Korea to reform because that would be good for everyone. Now, again, this is where I said earlier that An sometimes doesn't take material causes. He doesn't give them enough kind of emphasis. He doesn't think about them enough. But he did here show that he was moving in that direction. I think he would have dealt with them more if he would have had time. But he argued that Japan needed to put its economy in order. He correctly, in many ways, traced part of Japan's imperialism as directly related to its economy. And to help deal with that, he argued that Lushun, listed on this map as Port Arthur, should be made into a free port jointly managed with Chinese and Koreans. Right? Japan, a lot of the war, the Sino-Japanese and Russo-Japanese wars have been fought over this port, very, as you can see, strategically important. If you control that port, you can have a lot of influence on Korea. You also are directly connected to Beijing, Peking on this map. You can easily threaten that. So he wanted to make that a free port. And he wanted then to establish there a headquarters for a peace association, which would have branches throughout all of East Asia. And for a low membership cost, people could join this peace association. And the money from those membership fees would then be used to establish banks throughout China, Japan, and Korea that would issue a joint currency that could be used throughout the regions. And he seems to have thought this would allow for the better circulation of goods. It would actually allow Japan to export more. And this then would help the economic situation for everyone to improve. And one thing that we really have to give An credit for was he not only recognized that Japan had important economic concerns, he also recognized that Japan had security concerns, right? The Japanese Empire was a little different from other Western empires. For example, the United States took the Philippines, and it's kind of hard to argue that if we didn't colonize the Philippines, we face security threats. However, Japan could make that claim, for example, that if someone was to take Korea, then they could use Korea as a springboard to invade Japan or to otherwise threaten Japanese security. And An realized that. And so he argued in this hearing interview that if Japan gave up Lushun, Port Arthur, and shared it with China and Korea, that would gain it allies and improve its image abroad. Right, so An Chungun, he did have a kind of a better understanding than we might first think about what Japan needed. And that would give it this, in particular, it would give it its racial allies, right? China and Korea, and that would give it strength, right? And that was one of the basic ideas of An. Now, An also thought that other Asian countries would join. He thought India, Thailand, and several other Asian countries would join once Japan had done this, right? So he didn't see this as only being an East Asian alliance. And he argued that if Japan acted in this way, sought to deal with its security concerns in this way, Japan would become the hero of Asia. Now, it's important to keep in mind that An saw conflict as being the result of division. And he didn't just think of the division between yellow people, between Asian people. He was also concerned with the division between the West and the East, between white and yellow, not just within them. And so he had this kind of very novel idea for how to bring peace. He wanted to have the three emperors of China, Japan, and Korea crowned by the Pope. The Catholic Pope would crown them. And it seems that he was perhaps thinking of the crowning of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III and the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire there. But his idea here is that this would lead the West to respect the nation states of China, Japan, and Korea, right? The Pope, by crowning them, is saying these guys are legitimate nation states. You can't beat up on them anymore. You can't use imperialism against them anymore. And because there were so many Catholics in the West, because many of the Western countries were Catholic, this would lead them to respect the sovereignty of China, Japan, and Korea. But also what's key then is this would resolve this conflict between West and East. And so peace would spread to the West and become truly global. So An Chungun did not see anything intrinsically bad with the West, right? He was not a racist. His emphasis on Asianism was as a defensive non-racist unity that once conflict ended with the West would in a sense be left behind. It wouldn't be so important anymore because there would be no more conflict between West and East, so you didn't have to stay unified in the same way, being under threat. Now, he didn't think that this unity would just disappear. He wanted it to continue. But that was kind of his basic idea, that this would not just lead to East Asian peace, but world peace. Now, of course, there were some problems with An's ideas. For example, this idea of the Pope crowning the emperors it's a great idea in many ways, but it's also problematic. For example, the Japanese emperor claimed descent from the sun goddess, and that's why he said he was the emperor. That would obviously cause problems since Christians believe there's only one God. The Qing emperors, their right to rule was connected to the idea of the mandate of heaven, and they kind of claimed that for themselves, so that they didn't, I don't think, would be too congenial to the Pope crowning them. So there were some problems there. An at times misunderstood the international situation. So, for example, I gave you, this idea that he thought the Treaty of Portsmouth was something that was designed to help the Russians. It didn't. The Americans, President Theodore Roosevelt, was actually more favorable to the Japanese. In addition, he tended to play down material causes to focus on moral causes. And I think this was a developing area of his thought. As we saw, he would have dealt with that more because he did show real concern for Japanese security and economic interests. But those are some issues with his thought. Similarly, he wanted to try and bring this connection between regionalism, Asianism, and national independence. And this is kind of difficult to do, right? It's difficult to balance these multiple loyalties, right? What happens if you're in a situation where something is good for China but bad for Korea, right? How do you deal with that situation? And it would have been good. I think An maybe would have picked up that question, and that would have been great. But to give you an example, An wanted China, Japan, and Korea to have this kind of shared currency, and that's, that would be great. But also it can create problems because that currency might help one country more than the others. And it's hard to kind of accept that sometimes, right? You could see Japanese people saying, well, this currency's helping the Koreans more, it's helping us. What's going on here? Similarly, Lu Xun, Port Arthur, Han Chung-gun wanted that to become this city that would be managed by all three countries. And you can kind of see that being a problem because it was of such strategic importance for the defense of Beijing. The Japanese also likewise had lost lots of soldiers to actually seize the city. I don't think either one would have really been that open to sharing it. And it's difficult for Koreans to really make a good claim to why they should have some kind of control over it other than the fact that they're part of East Asia, right? But it's hard to imagine them just sharing it. And I didn't talk about it much earlier, but An Chung-gun actually also wanted to form a kind of a shared military between the three countries. And again, that would have a lot going for it. That would be really cool in a lot of ways, would make a lot of sense. But also, that's kind of a tricky thing, having these different soldiers. I can see problems with command, who are their ultimate loyalties to, and so forth. And then the problem, too, was that even though An Chung-gun had these really, really great ideas, I think, the problem was the means. His shooting of Ito Hirobumi kind of poisoned his message for some of the people he wanted to listen to him. He wrote this in a large part to convince Japanese people to change their minds. And it makes it a little hard for them to do that when he killed someone like Ito Hirobumi, who was so important in Japanese history and development. Now, of course, An Chung-gun thought that Ito was a really bad guy, and so it made sense to him. But a lot of Japanese people aren't going to accept that. So that kind of created a problem. But I include this picture here, though, to remind us that considering the situation An Chung-gun was in, he was writing this in prison. It's not like he had a library he had access to. He raised a lot of very good points and a lot of good things for us to think about. So I want to kind of end this lecture by talking about what I think are some of the important characteristics of An Chung-gun's thought. I don't want to say these are all of them, but these are some things that I think are important. So first of all, he really is challenging imperialism at this time. Right? He's really making this anti-imperialist argument, saying that maybe empire isn't the best way to organize things. Maybe it caused problems. And I think it's important to note that he challenges in particular this idea that weakness is what causes problems in the world. It's this kind of disturbing thing when you look at this period in history is there was a tendency to look at a country, and largely this had to do with social Darwinism. But, instead of looking at country and saying, hey, they're weak, maybe we should cut them a break. It's like, well, they're weak. They should be stronger, right? Survival of the fittest, right? If you're weak, you need to become strong. If you don't become strong and someone comes in and beats you up and takes your stuff, well, that was your fault. You should have been stronger. And An Chun-gun really challenges that and says, the problem in this world isn't that some countries are weak. It's not their fault, in a sense, right? There's things that are more complex. And they certainly don't deserve to be colonized because they're weak. The problem isn't weakness. The problem is this mixture of strength and immorality. That's what leads to war and conflict, right? So in this, he's challenging imperialism by saying maybe an imperialism that says, hey, these people are weak, so it's okay for us to take over their country in the name of reforming them. And An says, no, that's not the way that we should be doing things, right? We shouldn't just blame people and criticize them because they're weak. Instead, what we need to do is help them in a way that respects their sovereignty, right? We need to he wanted Japan to help Korea, but in a way that and China, but in a way that respected their sovereignty, and that was his idea, in a sense, by forming this kind of association, to have this way of the China, Japan, and Korea working together in solidarity while they all maintain their own sovereignty. He also recognized the problem of racism and noted noted this issue, while also affirming a common humanity. It's easy when we're, in a sense, I think, confronted with racism to embrace racist ideas ourselves. And An Chun-gun challenged that, right? He affirms a common humanity. He does not become anti-Japanese at all. He's just anti-Ito, for example. And even though he sees all these problems that are being caused by these predominantly white empires, he doesn't say, well, white people are intrinsically bad. He says they've just, kind of strayed away from morality, but that's something we can deal with, right? We can deal with this situation. And in this, in a sense, he has a kind of humanism. He's trying to consider the interests of all human beings. And he argues, I think, and I think this is the thing that is particularly important, whether you agree with what An Chun-gun did or not, whether you think it was right for him to kill Ito Hirobumi or practical or not, he did think that morality should be the primary guide for our actions, right? Not necessarily national greatness, not wealth and power, morality, right? And I think that's something we should think about when we think about how we behave and how nations behave.